Hey guys, Sarah here with you, and I want to give you like a quick look on the history of Final Fantasy. So let's go back to the 1980s, where Square started. And actually, I'm not exactly sure if Square started in the early 80s or the late 70s. Anyways, when they started, they made games, but they didn't do RPG games. They did other types of games, and the games weren't very successful for them, that they were almost broke. That's right, they were almost close to bankruptcy, and around the second half of the 1980s, RPGs were starting to kind of appear, and so they said, why not, let's try this new genre, and they made this game, and they ironically called it Final Fantasy, never knowing that would be like the biggest fantasy of our days these days. Final Fantasy, the first game, started in 1987. You had Nobuo Uematsu with the team from the very first game. Of course, he made the very popular Final Fantasy theme that always came into the end of every game. And of course, the start, which we always hear the prequel of the Final Fantasy series. So, Final Fantasy 1, it wasn't the first RPG, but it introduced lots of new elements. First of all, the older RPGs kind of treated you like a first-person gamer. You know, when you're like playing a game and you're a first-person shooter, you don't see exactly, you only see from your eyes, and so this is what it was. You only see your enemies in front of you. You didn't see your team members, and so when the damage came from your enemies, you don't see where it was going, and you don't see which one of your teammates got hit. So Final Fantasy was the first game that introduced your members on one side and the enemies on the other side, so you would know which one who would get the damage. So it was also one of the first games that introduced like interacting with the environment, like treasures and solving puzzles and dungeons and all that classical RPG kind of thing. And the story itself was very big, or very strong for its time. Final Fantasy II came, and well, it introduced a very iconic figure. It introduced Sid. So Sid appeared for the first time in Final Fantasy II, and of course, from the very first Final Fantasy, you had the large amounts of ships, you have airships and land ships and all that kind of thing. Then, I'm not exactly, just so you know, there was moguls and chocobos. I believe that they came in either 2 or 3. I'm not exactly sure, but they came in these games. I believe by about 90% that chocobos first appeared in Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III, by the way, had a very unique thing that it was introduced to the Final Fantasy series, summonings. Shiva and Ifrit and all of these classical creatures appeared for the very first time in Final Fantasy III. Then you have 4, which introduced the first time the ADV system. The ADV system, which is the adaptable time battle system, which you have like a time limit, and you need to kind of like perform your actions before the time runs out, or your enemy will attack. And then you had 5, and then you had 6, which was the last one for the Nintendo platform, classical NES, and Famicom type of platforms. Anyways, these first 6 games all had remakes, except for 3. 3 was a little special. All of the other 5, they were remade on the PlayStation. They were remade on the Game Boy Advance. 1 and 2 was probably the 2 most remade games. They had a version on the PSP, had a version on the mobile phone lately, and a version on every platform you can imagine. So 3 was a little exceptional. It never had a release outside of Japan until a couple of years when it was remade on the Nintendo DS. So the other 5 games, they were all remade, and it was introduced to, that time they were introduced to the NES, but 3 never came onto the NES, and it came later on the Nintendo DS. as a new remade game, or with the better graphics and all of this. And the first couple of games, even, I believe that 2 was renamed 4 in the US and 4 was renamed 2. There was a lot of mix and stuff going around with the titles. I believe 6, which had Terra and Kefka and all that, was introduced for the first time as Final Fantasy 3. So there was a lot of mixing in the whole series numbers in the way that was introduced in the US and in Japan. Then a new project was planned. It was Final Fantasy 7. Actually, was planned for the Nintendo platforms, the NES. But Final Fantasy 6 came in 1994, and they started 7. But they started 7, that year, or 1995. It was the same year that the PlayStation came, and the PlayStation was much stronger as a gaming platform than lots of other platforms. Just so you know, there was like the Sega, there was the Nintendo, there was the Atari, there was tons of other things, but there was this machine that had the 3D graphics. And so 7 was so big that they had to move it from the Nintendo platform to a better or higher quality platform, and that it was, you had the PCs and you had the PlayStation. So, and even when it came onto the PlayStation at the, in 1997, it was very big. You have 3 CDs. The gameplay was about at least 30 hours if you're not doing it as a speed run for the game. And it was the first 3D game. It did have some roots from the old games, and it introduced new aspects to the new Final Fantasies. From the old roots, when you're running around in the environments, you have those little tiny creatures, tiny characters, not creatures, tiny characters. That was kind of adapted from the other Final Fantasies, because the other Final Fantasies really looked small. And then the new evolution in Final Fantasy VII, 3D of course, the battle system, the whole complete change of the battle system was amazing. Then you have the environment also, which has changed dramatically. And then you moved on to, and of course, 7 had introduced a new type of story, because the old Final Fantasies were a little bit classical in the mid times, but then 7 was a little bit futuristic. And 7 was actually created by Tetsuya Nomura. He wasn't only the character designer, but he was also the one who wrote the story for 7. So it's like his little baby or something, because it's the longest series in the Final Fantasy series so far. Then you have 8. 8 kind of introduced for the first time the characters in 3D, and they look like real human. It was the other type of it was the second game for Tetsuya Nomura as a character designer. Just so you know, the first game that Tetsuya Nomura worked on with Square was 5. He was a monster designer, but the first game as a character designer for him was 7, and then 8, which kind of had a big improvement in the graphics. Backgrounds almost stayed the same between 7 and 8. Then you had 9, which went back to the classical roots, but the graphics of the backgrounds completely changed. That was amazing. And just so you know, the first 6 games was done by Amano. Amano's the same person who does the logos of Final Fantasy, which I love. His art is very unique. Then you moved on to 10, which was the first Final Fantasy on the PlayStation 2 with voices in real emotions and characters in between the cutscenes, and it was really amazing and a revolution for its time. And then I believe it was the first RPG on the PlayStation 2. Then you had 11, the first MMO, and then you had 12, which kind of introduced that you'd be able to rotate the camera around of your characters. And so far I have 13, which I'm very eagerly awaiting, and it's the first game for the Xbox 360. So that was kind of a quick look on the history of Final Fantasy. I'm running out of time here, so I'll wrap this up. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll be making more videos like this later. So I'll see you in another video. Later, guys.